So Murray was 14 years old, and as we mentioned, our exhibit focuses on the teenage experience of the war. So he was 14 years old when his family was deported from Hungary and sent to Auschwitz. So this would be 1944. When he entered the camp, I think I'm correct in saying, Murray, you weighed about 140 pounds. After the death march that he was put on in liberation in 1945, he weighed 65 pounds. So 140 to 65 pounds. After spending time in a hospital, Murray returned briefly to Hungary before moving to the Czech Republic to study in the theological seminary. He was brought to England and then ultimately to Ireland, where he and 120 orphans who had survived the camps were housed in Clonan Castle, and we'll talk about that in a moment. He remained there for 2 years before coming to the United States, completed a bachelor's degree at City University of New York, an MBA at NYU, and came to Atlanta in 1956. So if you think back, that would be during President Eisenhower's administration, right, the 1950s, barely, 11 years after the end of the war, and has made Atlanta his home and enjoyed a very successful business career, has retired, but is still very active in the Atlanta community. So a very interesting and long history that he will have a chance to recount in a moment. But I want to step back for a moment and give some sort of historical context, because I was lecturing this morning to my students in their Holocaust class that the fact that once the war ended, once liberation, once armistice came, it was not the end of the war for many people, that people were put in displaced persons camps, that in some cases for as long as 5, 6, 7 years. So we tend to think about, VE Day and the sort of concept of victory, and for many people that was slow in coming. But what led us to this point, I certainly don't have time to detail all of the history of the final solution, but I do think it's important to use an analogy that if we think of what Adolf Hitler was trying to do in the National Socialist program in Europe from 1933 to 1945, imagine the analogy as tightening a noose. So if in 1933 the noose is relatively wide and it starts to close and close and close around the neck of Europe, and it certainly wasn't just Jews who were swept up in that net. It's a very large and diverse populace, from Jehovah's Witnesses to political prisoners to homosexuals that were sort of swept up in that net. But very importantly, it was distinctively Jewish in some really significant and terrible ways, in that Hitler was certainly trying to rid Europe of people he deemed undesirable, but he was specifically targeting what he called European Jewry and international Jewry. So the final solution, it's very difficult for historians to pinpoint the exact moment when he solidified his perspective on the final solution, but I do think it's really important for all of us to think about the fact that it had there were a lot of small steps that he took. The Nuremberg laws in 1935 that restricted people's access to civil service, and they lost jobs and rights, to things like Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, all the way through finally at Wannsee in Germany, where a lot of historians have said that's really where the conversation about finally destroying all of Europe actually happened. So final solution was not something that that Hitler had planned out very clearly at the beginning, but certainly if you read Mein Kampf, his book from 1923, you really can see a plan. You can see almost a blueprint, but it's more complicated than that. A lot of circumstances sort of intervened. So the concept of the camp system, historically, if you look at, there are major death camps that we know now, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Sobibor, Treblinka, but there were many other camps. In fact, in some, the German government essentially created a system of 10,000 camps. Some of them were deportation camps, some of them were labor camps, some of them were what we know as the extermination centers. So I want you all to have that in your mind as we're sort of working our way through. And what the Nazis were trying to do, and certainly at the very beginning, is that they did not have the mass gassing as the original plan. They tried a whole host of solutions, and they would have, the Einsatzgruppen were mobile killing units, that there were all kinds of ways that the Nazis terrorized Europe, but it's really not until after 41 that they start doing the wholesale destruction of European Jewry with the gas chambers as we know them today. So we don't really have time to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to put that in context. So let me just sort of skim forward and see where. Do I need to point it at anything, Laura? Okay. Murray, something interesting, and Murray told us this when we were doing the exhibit. It's not just my story, it's our collective narrative that must survive the survivors. I think pretty handsome man up there, so you're going to get to meet him in just a moment. I do want to sort of, as I was saying, the sort of route to the final solution is long and certainly dreadful as we move forward, but seeing it in stages, I think, helps historians understand how this program ultimately moved forward. The extermination camps, what we refer to as sort of the big 6 camps, and Murray will talk about his experience at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Let's keep going. In Auschwitz, more people died in Auschwitz than British and American losses in World War II combined. I think that's a staggering figure, if you can imagine. And simply the $250 million generated by the slave labor. And also the terrible irony at the bottom. The Star of David was placed above the entrance to the gas chamber, and a sign was painted in Hebrew on a purple curtain covering the entrance that said, "This is the gateway to God. Righteous men will pass through." So I think guards and the staff that it took to run Auschwitz, and only 750 ultimately punished. Let's talk for just a moment about the fate of Hungarian Jews, because that would have been Murray's experience. In 1941, the Jewish population, 825,000, 6%. 1944, 63,000 had been killed prior to the German occupation. Under the occupation, another 500,000 died from either maltreatment or were murdered. And just, if you have not thought about where Hungary is, I thought it useful for you to get a sense of what a dangerous place Europe certainly would have been, but of course Hungary, Romania, Austria would have been right in the German path. Okay, let me just talk for a moment about Clonan Castle, and then I'm going to hand it over to Murray and let him begin his story. Built in 1639, since 1883 it had multiple owners, including the Sisters of the Sacred Heart. After World War II, it was a center for Jewish refugees, and that's where Murray's going to come in. And this is, does that look familiar, Murray? I've never even seen a photograph, but I believe it does. So by way of introduction, just wanted to give you a hint at what we're going to talk about. I'd like to introduce Murray. Lynn, have him come to the podium. Now, Murray, you want to stand at the podium so we can film you, and then we'll have a chance to do questions as we progress. Okay, sir. You can just leave it if you'd like. Yep, that should be fine.
And good evening. It's an honor to be here in this historic, beautiful place to share with you my personal story. I'm not going to place a lot of emphasis on Auschwitz per se, because most of you heard some of the horrors we experienced, but I felt that it would be more useful for you to get a better grasp how this happened and why it happened. And at the end, we'll have a chance to ask particular questions. Those of you who are interested in life, about life in Auschwitz, I'll be glad to discuss it with you. But I felt that I would prefer to give you a broader view so you'll have a better grasp of what it was like being Jewish in Hungary before the Second World War, what it was like living as a minority, where minorities were not tolerated. So that's what I'm going to place emphasis on. I have roughly a 35-minute narrative, and after that we'll have some time for questions. My story is about the human capacity to suffer, to lose, to heal, and to rebound. But it also lays bare man's basest instincts, man's abysmal failures, the willful silence, the willful blindness, and the shameful apathy of world leaders as we were herded like sheep to the slaughterhouse. For Jews, the 20th century has touched the deepest layers of our collective and individual lives. It left a festering legacy that will haunt our children and succeeding generations to the end of time. As a young idealist, I nurtured the illusion that the lessons of the bloodiest war in history would surely usher an irresistible tide of social justice, sweeping away all cultural inequities and banishing the scourge of hatred for all time. But it was a grand youthful delusion. Barely 2 generations later, egregious human rights abuses and genocide in Europe, Africa, and Asia is still rampant. It's a grim reminder that of all human dramas, none is more enduring, none more deeply rooted in the human soul than mankind's wicked racial instincts. In Europe, racism was a moral rot that plagued the continent for centuries. No juxtaposition could have been more jarring. One represented the height and depth of civilization. The other, its most abysmal crime in the history of mankind. In spite of our deep ancestral roots in Hungary, Jews were treated as intrusive and unwelcome aliens. Rather than focusing on endemic backwardness, fighting cultural wars, and Jews in particular, has always been the mother of all causes. For most part, Europe had no tradition of tolerance and social justice. It was the cradle and breeding ground of a creed of hatred that stripped our people of all humanity. Over the centuries, its practitioners of injustice and prejudice have included saints and scoundrels, skeptics and believers, the meek and the mighty, authors and politicians, fascists and communists, people of every creed and culture in every station of life, whether out of pious faith or primal fear. They all had one common cause and a common mission: to discredit, to demonize, to vilify and marginalize our faith, and extinguish every flickering vestige of our heritage. The cultural divide defined our fate. It was one of history's cruelest verdicts against us. Living under such oppressive conditions, it was virtually impossible to rise above the station of life in which you were born. Given the ageless church-state sanctioned hostility, our demise was predictable, indeed predicted. The Nazis drew myths, falsehoods, and conspiracy theories from European history, not least the stigmatic yellow badge of shame. As far back as 1215, the Church's Fourth Lateran decreed that Jews must be differentiated from all others by the type of clothing to avoid intercourse between Christian and Jews. This vile and degrading manifesto was prosaically inbred in its creed and stoked the fires of strident prejudice and spasms of violence. Every populist movement needs a catalytic issue in a crystallizing response to symbolize an ideology, and the Jews have always been convenient and vulnerable targets. When I came to these shores in my late teens in 1949, I could not shake loose of the deeply embedded institutional prejudices foisted in my soul and my consciousness. I was dogged by fear of rejection, nagging insecurities, and just low self-esteem. It was an excruciating struggle to liberate myself from the haunting legacy of exclusion in the shackles of oppression that mired our ancestors in hopelessness and abject poverty for countless generations. As a new immigrant, I desperately yearned for a new dawn, free of strife, and the opportunity to transform my life from victim to self-empowerment in a country of meritocracy. But my flashbacks and haunting images invaded my life and my dreams. It followed me like the shadow in the night. I was trapped in a universe cut in two by a great divide, the past and the present, two colliding forces. For a clearer perspective, let me briefly shift the spotlight to the beginning of my changing universe. My childhood started to unravel in an inauspicious spring evening in 1942. We were awakened by a thundering knock on the door by the dreaded fascist secret police. They burst into our house with two snarling bulldogs and bayonets aimed at Dad, ordering him to get dressed and follow them to an unknown destination. Hysterical, my parents demanded to know why and where Dad was being taken, but their plea was ignored. Dad took his prayer book, bid us an emotional farewell, and was whisked away into the silent darkness, only to be broken by whining dogs. We were left gasping for comprehension and gripped us with fear for our safety and our ability to survive without him. 2 weeks later, we were horrified to learn that Dad and 12 other Jewish community leaders were taken on a death march to the remote Carpathian Mountains, where they were summarily executed and dumped in a mass grave. Dad was 42. It was a harbinger of more horrors to come. What followed marked our lives by an appalling catalog of suffering, fear, and existential nightmares. The Nazis transformed anti-Semitism from a cultural to a political issue. It became a state ideology that moved from the backwaters to the mainstream. We were identified as a manifestation of their most ubiquitous enemy. Its roots lay in the tradition that haunted Europe since the Christian medieval times, marked by crusades, Spanish inquisitions, and fluctuating currents of hostility, spasms of violence, and waves of savage pogroms. While Germany and Russia were bastions of virulent anti-Semitism over the years, currents of intolerance also ran deep in such enlightened countries as France and England. In 1290, 200 years before the Spanish Inquisition, Edward I expelled all Jews from England. Ironically, it was 75 years after the much-hailed Magna Carta became law. No professed Jew lived in England from 1290 to 1650. For a period of 350 years, no professed Jew lived in Great Britain. Just a few years later, in 1306, Philip IV ordered all Jews expelled from France. It was a tidal wave of orchestrated terror that engulfed the continent. From St. Augustine in the 5th century to Martin Luther in the 16th century, some of the most eloquent and persuasive theologians taught that Jews were rebels against God and guilty of apostasy. They preached that Jewish misfortune was God's judgment against them for rejecting Christ. Such inciting remarks redefined the gospel of love and tolerance into a doctrine of intolerance and contempt of Jews. The consequences were far-reaching. Absolutist theological claims and institutional universalism led directly to the oppression of Jews. caricatured vision of Jews became a staple of European popular culture, demonizing us as swindlers, unscrupulous moneylenders. It gave rise to rabid anti-Semitism and metastasized like a cancer. Anti-Semitism works by making Jews the defendants of a trumped-up social and political charge. As an example, socialists attacked us as greedy capitalists and exploiters of the masses. Racists assaulted us as communist saboteurs, subversives, and treacherous manipulators of their economy. Nationalists and ultra-right wingers condemned us as revolutionaries and revisionists. The church maligned us as rebels against God and unrepentant sinners and heretics. Groups from a broad spectrum of ideas and ideological perspectives found a common cause. The common cause was pinning the blame on Jews for all of European ills. Ironically, even atheists like Voltaire espoused this common cause. Voltaire inspired anti-Semitism because he was part of a school of philosophers who were against religion. They thought religion in general kept the masses down. They believed religion was something like an opiate for the masses, whatever religion it was. And who is responsible for religion? The Jews, of course. Why the Jews? Because Jesus was Jewish. Therefore, not only were Jews responsible for giving birth to Jesus, Jews were also responsible for killing him. So either way, you had it. Clearly, we were a beleaguered people, trapped in an undying mythology, fueled by state-sanctioned, inciting theologies, and forever caught in a crossfire between right and left, theology and atheism, autocracies and theocracies. We were always on trial. In spite of systemic prejudices, oppression, and marginalization, we were remarkably sustained during the most abysmal years in our history by three spiritual pillars: faith, hope, and the unshaken belief in the messianic redemption. It was our rock. Faith and hope was our opiate, the healer, the therapeutic underpinning that dulled our sensitivities in our pain and lulled us into a state of passivity and resignation. The Holocaust spawned a wave of cynicism among survivors. Many of us felt that God abrogated his covenant to protect us against the forces of evil. This irreverent notion continues to resonate in our consciousness. We're still in search of rational answers about why we were abandoned by God and God-fearing man. Some of us made peace with our fate, while others continue to harbor resentment, doubt, and cynicism against all faiths for abandoning us during our darkest hour in history. It should be remembered that world silence and apathy fed Hitler's mendacity and emboldened him and his fanatical followers to implement his racist and murderous ideologies. Hitler gave impetus to a creed of hate and prejudice deeply entrenched in its culture, simmering and boiling since Martin Luther's raging diatribes against Jews. When Hitler unleashed his rage and fury against the Hungarian Jews in the spring of 1944, my mom was a 36-year-old widow with 4 young children. Remember, my dad was murdered 2 years earlier by the fascists. My mom was 34 at the time. 2 years later, my mom was murdered. And by the way, I should mention this to you. My mom, 15 years before she was taken to Auschwitz, she was crowned as a regional beauty queen. I have a picture of her, of Hungary. She was a beautiful woman. So I was 14 years old in 1944, at the age of, and the oldest of 4 brothers. What followed was a seismic shift in our history and our lives. Swiftly and ruthlessly, the dreaded secret police, the Hungarian Gestapo, surrounded all Jewish homes in our town. With snarling bulldogs at their sides, they gave us 1 hour to pack our bags and follow them to a train station to an unknown destination. The hysterical scene could have been a backdrop for a horror movie. Children and the infirm, victims of all ages, trudging with our hastily assembled necessities for survival in sheets and blankets, bulging over our backs, while gleeful spectators lined the streets, jeering and taunting us and chanting a chorus of epithets as we were marched to our doom. It was an orchestrated scene in a diabolic show. I will never forget the raw and ghoulish display of deep-seated cultural animosity that gripped the continent and unleashed a torrent of hatred. Against the rising tide of madness, its culture had become unshakably convinced that the Jews, not Hitler, were the real enemies of its people. By pinning the blame on the Jews for every social and political malady was inbred in the European creed. Over the years, every revolutionary spasm, every nationalist movement, every economic unrest needed a scapegoat to stoke the passions of rage, and the Jews have always been convenient targets and helpless defendants. Auschwitz was the inevitable outcome of these ancient mythologies. After a year of appalling existential nightmares at Auschwitz, in April 1945, I was liberated by the Americans. I was 15 years old, sick, skeletal, disoriented. I was on the brink of death. It took 3 weeks of hospitalization to nurse me back to life. And yet, I was lucky, much luckier than the rest of my family. They all perished in the ghoulish inferno of Auschwitz. I was the sole survivor. After being discharged from the hospital, I had to make some agonizing choices. To remain at the displacement camp where I would be cared for, or to return home to face an uncertain future. I had no illusions about what I would find at home, but I chose to go back for closure and to look for remnants of my lost past. What I found was our home occupied by hostile strangers and only smoldering images of an irretrievable past. I had to deal with myriad of issues beyond my age and beyond my grasp. Guilt, fear, anger, loneliness, insecurity, and just primal concerns of survival. In the end, defining a context to restore and regenerate my life became an overarching issue and an unswerving mission. But first, I had to reconnect with my dull sensitivities, reconnect with realities, and reconnect with civilization and civilized values. For a while, I floated around aimlessly like a rudderless vessel, praying for divine guidance and direction. I was in search of my soul, in search of an oasis and peace of security where I could proclaim triumphantly, free at last, secure at last. Alone at home in a hostile environment, I was incessantly haunted by raw memories, a lost universe, and a childhood frozen in time. One day, I decided on a 2.5-mile trek to our 18th century synagogue to seek solace and peace. It was the only synagogue in town, the place where my ancestors had worshipped for countless generations. What I found shocked me to the core. The doors and windows were stripped. The Torah and priceless ancient prayer books were gone. There were epithets all over the walls, inside and out. The startling sight was testament to the hateful pathologies in irrational rage, so deeply rooted in the culture's DNA. It gave me the added impetus to abandon my roots. Looking around me reinforced my conviction that Hitler's defeat did not change the basest instincts of its culture. It had not stilled the furies of hatred. I had a rendezvous with destiny. America was my pillar of hope. It was a daring journey for a 15-year-old without a clairvoyant view of my next destination, without financial resources, without much guidance and direction. But my primal need for unfettered freedom and security, and the need to abandon the evocative ghost of the past, by far outweighed the inherent risk of a solitary journey. Equally compelling, the Soviet Union had already annexed our section of eastern Hungary to its rapidly expanding empire, cutting it off from the mainland. The Iron Curtain was swiftly descending over its occupied borders, initiating a reign of terror against free thinkers and dissenters. Being trapped yet in another tyranny was a dreadful option I could not live with. It was the fall of 1945. I had to act decisively before the heavy snowfall. During the following 4 years, my saga took on the character of a solitary pilgrimage. Trekking through the inhospitable barriers of the jagged Carpathian mountains on foot, horse and mule-drawn wagons, rickety freight trains was a daunting human drama. I meandered from one medieval village to the next, in one country to the next, always fearful of being apprehended by the border police. All the while, I slept in abandoned barns, freight cars, railway stations, and farms. With the guidance of the Jewish community, my odyssey led me from eastern Hungary to Romania, then to central Hungary, and ultimately to the Czech Republic, the way station to the west. It was my residence for 2 years as a student at a theological seminary. In 1948, a Jewish rescue agency from Great Britain was dispatched to the Czech Republic on a humanitarian mission to rescue over 100 orphans, all Holocaust survivors ranging in ages from 7 to 18, about a third hidden and rescued by Christian families. After identifying and collecting this scattered and diverse group, we were temporarily relocated to London and then moved to Dublin, Ireland, our residence for a year at a Clonan Castle. By the fall of 1949, all of us were assigned and relocated to new homes to 6 different countries. Over half of the children went to Israel, the rest to Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S. It was a triumphant culmination of a grueling 4-year odyssey in a watershed in my life. I emerged from this arduous odyssey more seasoned. It transformed me from boyhood to manhood. While coursing through the landscapes of diffuse cultures, its gritty slums, impoverished villages, and scars of war, it galvanized my resolve and tested the limits of my boundaries in the depths of my inner strength. Hardship is a tough taskmaster. It teaches us enduring lessons about the essence of life. What sustained my spirit during my 4-year saga were the haunting, surreal images of suffering and despair. No less important was the conviction that human dignity demands freedom of conscience and the inherent right to master our destiny. My narrative is a testament to the resilience of the indomitable human spirit. It speaks resoundingly and glowingly of the power people have within themselves to overcome unimaginable suffering and our ability to rebound, mend what was broken, and regenerate life. I came to this country at a propitious age of barely 19 by following a dream that was both deeply hopeful and profoundly American: the second chance. The place of redemption in a country of meritocracy where anyone can start over, where the only barriers one would face are the limits of our dreams and ambitions. It was a great leap toward the realization of my dreams and aspirations. And yet, there were new and uncharted mountains to climb, though less intimidating than the Carpathian Mountains. Finding a permanent home, securing financial resources, dealing with culture shock, loneliness, lack of marketable skills, language barriers, insecurity, and finally defining a context and strategic plan for rebuilding my life, all overwhelming challenges beyond my age. But the most daunting challenge was unloading the onerous emotional baggage and putting the past behind me. Straddling between two worlds incessantly sapped much of my emotional energy and became a zero-sum game. In the end, I had to make peace between the heart and mind. I resolved to reinvent myself, recast my life, and transform it from victim to self-empowerment. I unleashed my pent-up yearning and summoned my inner resources to aim beyond my reach and maximize my potential. Mindful that education was a great equalizer, it was the only viable option and roadmap to my ambitions and aspirations. After 6 years of undergraduate and graduate education in New York City, I yearned for a more relaxed lifestyle. In the fall of 1956, I moved to Atlanta to pursue a business career. My varied business career ultimately led to senior executive positions, including president and CEO of various companies. But my most crowning achievement was raising a generation of children involved in the human service professions and community leadership. They will be the heirs to my legacy, bear witness when I'm gone, retell my narrative, and keep our experience alive with regards to man's infinite capacity for cruelty and monstrous evil. No less important, there is a poignant epilogue to this narrative that is enshrined in my children's consciousness. They will wistfully tell the world what they missed as children, without the tender love of paternal grandparents, and the void in their childhood without aunts, uncles, cousins, so critical to a child's healthy development. They, too, were unwitting victims of Hitler's maniacal madness. The ugly climax of the 20th century offers compelling moral and strategic lessons. Appeasing tyrants is a snare and delusion, because it only emboldens them on an endless quest for more sessions. Lest we forget, the Nazis did not invent anti-Semitism. They merely codified the myths and realities that existed for many centuries that legitimized their heinous crimes against Jews. It then exploded into a feeding frenzy across Europe. Over the centuries, we were persecuted not because we were evil, but because evil was sought in us because we differed in our beliefs. We were persecuted not for a wrong we had done, but for who we were. We were oppressed and persecuted because we steadfastly held on to our beliefs and to honor and uphold the faith of our ancestors. Indeed, our past is a grim reminder that the greatest threat to pluralism and religious freedom are the apostles of purity and fanaticism who claim sole possession of the truth about how to live and what ideologies and theologies to invoke and embrace. Worse yet, the dangerous precepts that those who differ in their beliefs are subversives or evil apostates. Unlike our country's framers' precepts, refusing to give primacy of one religion over another, in Europe, religious primacy was a de facto way of life, wedded to state power and often exploited for its own malign purposes. The moral imperatives of the last century have been made clear to us by millions of names inscribed in a cold stone of the Holocaust memorial. And yet, too many rogue nations and unconscionable cynics have found it more comfortable to cleave to vague moral relativism to redefine our history. The Middle East has now replaced Europe as the touchstone of corrupt policies and politics, in the flashpoint of hateful ideologies exported to every continent to spark divisive cultural conflicts. They blurred the lines between right and wrong, religion and ideologies. As in the past, religion is invoked as an instrument for malign purposes. Once again, there are no howls of indignation from professed moralists or stewards of religious doctrines. It rekindles old memories and opens old wounds and triggers new emotions. It is a tinderbox smoldering with irrational rage, a conflagration waiting to happen. The purveyors of theocracies and violence must be reminded that the essence of Islam is encapsulated in the words of the Quran, and I quote, "For you, your religion, for me, my religion." That's the essence of tolerance. Let me conclude with an admonition from a noted scholar and Presbyterian minister, Dr. Franklin Littell, the author of Crucifixion of Jews. In it he says, and I quote, "The church must come to grips with incontrovertible truth of history, that a Holocaust was a consummation of centuries of false teachings. The meaning of the Holocaust for Christians must be built into confession of faith and remembered in hymns and prayers. Until the church comes clean, very little they say about the plight of other victims will carry authority," end quote. And finally, on a personal note, let me say this. We have reached our golden years, and it's our last act in the human drama. The lights are slowly dimming. We who once lived as if each day, each hour would surely be our last, are once again on the brink of final extinction. Soon our voices will be muted by age and infirmities and remembered only by history. As educators, you will be the stewards and guardians of our legacy. You will be a flare in the night to the misguided and the misinformed. Your audiences must be told that there was a time when man lost his moral compass. There was a time when far too many men, masquerading in the garb of piety and the cloak of righteousness, betrayed and devalued the precepts of the gospel. Instead of embracing the Jews as their spiritual brothers, they embraced the pernicious ideology of the swastika. By omission or commission, they were complicit in aiding and abetting our sworn enemy. Willful silence and apathy is a cardinal sin. It must never be accorded absolution. Thank you. Yes, I will be, I'm available for any questions. The only thing I'm going to ask you, I'm just a little hard of hearing, and it comes with a turf. So if if you don't mind, speak a little louder or come closer so I don't have to harass you and ask you the same question 2 or 3 times. So feel free to ask any questions that you might be interested in.
Murray, while people are thinking, may I ask you one? And you alluded to the moment when your family was taken away to Auschwitz and you're faced with your friends and neighbors heckling you. Can you say something more about what that experience was like?
I'm glad you picked up on that. You know, there are many episodes that stick in my mind. This one in particular, when we were, just imagine one morning at 5 or 6 in the morning, we were surrounded and we were given an hour to pack our bags. Those days we didn't have luggage. We had to put, most of us were poor, although my parents were middle-class people, but we didn't have luggage. We didn't travel in those days. So we had to take our belongings and sheets and blankets, and our neighbors and many of the town people, and by the way, I lived in a community of about 30,000, which is roughly 125 miles northeast of Budapest. And the town people were notified that we are going to be taken to the train station. So here we are, all terrified. Everyone is crying and wailing and hysterical. Gave us 1 hour, sick people, old people, young people carrying their belongings on their back in sheets and blankets. And the town people lining up the streets on both sides of the streets as we're being led by the Gestapo with bayonets pointing at us and German shepherds on one side and bayonets on the other. And they're lined up on the streets, taunting us, spitting at us, throwing trash at us. That was the most devastating experience that one can have. This is as we were led to our doom. A few weeks later, we were taken first to a collection camp where we were all. This was like a week or 10 days before my parents were. My mom and my 3 brothers were gassed. It was a ghoulish display of hatred that I will never forget. And some of those people lining the streets, we knew. Some of them were neighbors. We thought that they were our friends. We didn't realize the deeply embedded hatred that they had for Jewish people. Now here we are living in a small community. There was no justification for it. We lived in a small community of about 35,000. We had roughly 200 families living in that, Jewish families in that town. Only about 7 or 8 of us survived out of the 200. I was one of them. They were all wiped out. And so this is something that sticks out in my mind, that traumatizes me even now. I remember my 3 younger brothers and myself carrying in sheets and blankets with pots and pans and bread and the bare necessities to survive. And from both sides, on both sides of the streets, they're hurling trash and spitting at us and hurling epithets at us. It was an experience I will never forget. For that reason, I would never go back home. After the war, I went back home for a short period of time, but since I moved from there, I would never set foot again because it evokes too many ugly memories. Yes.
I know that you barely survived the end of the liberation, but at another time when I was with you, you shared a story about your cousin who opted not to survive.
You know, very often people ask me when Auschwitz, they took 1,800,000 Jews were taken to Auschwitz, and roughly 1.6 million, according to archives. These are not my figures. This is based on archives. Roughly 1.6 million were perished in Auschwitz, including my mom, who was 36, and my 3 younger brothers, my grandparents, my uncles. But those of us who were not taken immediately to the gas chambers were assigned striped suits, supposedly to go to work. Well, that was also a death sentence. We were all sentenced to death. Some of them to the gas chambers, others were sentenced to slow death. Auschwitz, going to work was a sentence to slow death because they fed us, and I'll get to your question in a minute, but I want to point out something. We were fed in the morning 1 slice of bread and black coffee, nothing at noontime. At night, we were given a cup of foul-tasting potato soup or turnip soup, and that was our diet for the day. We estimated roughly 150 calories. Those of you who know dietetics and what it takes to survive, it takes an average person 1,800 calories to 2,000. If you are large and athletic, it takes 3,000 or more calories. We tried to survive on 150, 160 calories a day. It was impossible. We ate grass, we ate bugs, we ate worms. Every morning we had roll call at 5 o'clock. The purpose of the roll call is to call out the sick and the weak. And they told us that those who were called out, the sick and the weak, they told them they were going to a hospital. But a hospital was a euphemism for the gas chamber. We all knew what it was. I was picked out no less than 10 times because this was roughly after 6 months at Auschwitz. I was in Birkenau, the second camp. I was taken out I was selected no less than 10 times to go to the so-called hospital, and I knew what it meant. And I slipped back to the main line. My cousin, his name was Sam Green. He was bigger, taller, stronger than I was, but he was also deeply weakened from malnutrition. He volunteered instead of me. And I said to him, Sam, do you know where you're going? You're not going to the hospital. And he said something to me that I'll never forget. He says, Murray, I know where I'm going, but I'm only going to suffer for 2 or 3 minutes. But staying alive like this, he says, is suffering for maybe days, maybe weeks, maybe months. I can't take it anymore. He says it's easier to die than live like this. And he was 15 at the time. He knew where he was going. But that was, I wore, and again, I didn't want to burden you too much about Auschwitz. I wore the same suit for 1 year. Let me take this back. For half a year, I wore the same suit striped suit, no underwear, no socks. My body was so infested with lice, it looked like sesame seeds were scattered all over my body, my hair, my nose. We had constant diarrhea, dysentery. We slept in 3-tier decks. The worst deck was the bottom deck because we always they urinated on each other. We had no cover, no blankets. We slept without blankets, without mattresses. And my clothes looked like it was taken out of the sewage. My pants, my clothes looked like it was taken out of a sewage plant. It was never washed. I never took a shower in 1 year. Never cleaned up in 1 year. So I don't need to tell you anymore. It was a grotesque existence. My clothes were torn up. I took a jacket. After 6 or 7 months, a friend of mine died in a barrack, and I took his jacket, and I wore his jacket because his jacket was better than mine. Took his jacket off. And the first thing we did is when we would take out dead people from the barracks every morning, first thing we did is checked his pockets to see if there's a crumb of bread or something. And those who we didn't take their slacks because their slacks were worse like ours. You know, we urinated and did everything in our pants. We never, there was no toilet paper. So I don't need to tell you, I don't want to get into too many graphics. But we were treated worse than animals. no showers, no soap. It was just survival of the fittest. Why some people survived and others didn't, some of it is the mental stamina, some of it is genetic, some of it was faith, and some of it was a combination of all the above. But I was in a coma when I was liberated, and I was fed intravenously for 3 weeks. And I was lucky that I was fed intravenously because those who ate solid food overate, and they died by the hundreds and hundreds. Their bodies could not absorb the solid food, and they couldn't survive. By the hundreds died. So it was an existential nightmare, folks. It was. That's why I don't like to get into this, because it evokes too many memories, and I know most of you have heard these stories, and unless there's a particular interest, I'm not going to go into any more of this. Any other questions that I might answer to any of you? If you don't mind, come a little closer, ma'am. I hate to impose this on you.
Well, I'm a teacher, I'm good at shouting.
Oh, okay. All right. Go ahead.
I so appreciate your first-person account.
What, ma'am?
Your first-person account, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. As you talk about the scars of the intolerance and prejudicial violence that was heaped upon you, I was curious as to why you chose to come to Georgia, in the southern region of the United States in the 1950s, given the intolerance and the racial violence that went on here. Yeah. And as far as the sensitivity, when you hear it, how do you sensitive to it, or you think, well, that's not me? I mean, I was wondering how you kind of...
Hey, Georgia.
Yeah.
I'll pick Georgia. That's a fair question. I didn't know I was naive. I didn't know much about Georgia. All I knew, it was backward, and I said, that's what I want. I want to go to a backward part of the country where life is slow. I hated New York. And I said, I asked a lot of people, I says, I would like to get out of New York. Let me tell you what turned me off, and this is sort of funny. This is just digressing for a minute. And I was going to school, I was taking a literature course, and we were required, on one occasion, we were required to read the New York Times. And I stopped at a newsstand to pick up, I'll never forget this experience, stopped up at a newsstand to pick up the New York Times, and they were out of New York Times. And the guy says to me, well, I'm out of New York Times, besides you would know how to read it anyway. And this is typical New York, needlessly offending people, needlessly abusing. And I said to myself, this was just an incentive for me to leave. This is towards the end of my education career. And these are some of the things, that motivated me, that kind of attitude, arrogant attitude. Besides, also, immigrants were not very, very looked at very kindly. There were a lot of immigrants in New York, and we were not considered, we were sort of considered by some people as subhuman. They didn't know what we went through. And I just happened to pick the South, ma'am, at random. I didn't know much about the South. I was flabbergasted when I came to the South and I saw the segregation. And I was involved, by the way, in earlier years with Martin Luther King, not Luther. I was involved in the civil movements, civil rights movement. But I didn't know at that time when I left the severity of segregation here. It was a real cultural shock to me to find out. But in the end, I'm glad that I came. I met my wife here. My wife is from Tennessee. And I call her a kid hillbilly. It's my daughter sitting there in the black sweater, and my wife, my children were born and raised in Atlanta. So in all, it was a good move to come to Atlanta. I'm glad I did. But in earlier days, I had some regrets why I came to Atlanta. I don't know whether I answered your question. I went into a long. Did I answer your question, ma'am? Right. 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 For,
And then also, I remember thinking, why don't Native Americans pass on a lot of their legacy stories? Or why have a lot of African Americans passed on? And I now know because of the rawness and the emotion, and maybe was this sign, maybe trying to protect the generations from not knowing how horrible it was.
right.
That's what's happened with other ethnic groups too.
Right.
Murray, we probably have time for one more question.
Okay. Anyone else may have a question? Yes, ma'am.
What was life like at the Irish castle, and did you ever think of staying in Ireland?
Well, that was the question is what was life like life in the castle. And I remember this after sleeping in barns and parks and freight trains for 2 years and being homeless. That was an incredible experience. Living in a castle, we were there in that castle, roughly 120 children. Roughly half of them were hidden by Christian families. Some of them were very disturbed and we received, many of us, I didn't need it, thank goodness, but many of them received counseling because they were first surrendered by Jewish parents, and then when this gentleman came from Great Britain, Dr. Schoenfeld, to reclaim those kids from the families whose parents perished, now they lost the second parent. It was very traumatic for those children to be yanked away. Some of them converted to Catholicism, and it was very, very traumatic. So many of us went through counseling for many, many months. But it was, all in all, it was a wonderful experience for us to live in a civilized country. It was a turning point. It was a watershed for me because this was my stepping stone to the States. And I came to the States, two of us received scholarships. We came to the States, and so it was, and the rest of them scattered all over the world. You had a question, ma'am.
I was going to ask how you got situated once you got to New York, because you didn't have any family, or did you have any family in New York? And then, you had a language issue, but you got into school, you got educated, you got a master's degree. So how did that all, was there a system that helped you out, or did they just sort of say, here, New York, go?
I found out that my mom had an older sister living in New York who came to this country before the war in the mid-30s. And she was a poor lady living in Brooklyn. And I lived with them for 6 years while I was going to school. And I worked during the day. I worked in a liquor store. I remember earning $15 an hour. And, $15 a week, not an hour. I earned $15 a week, worked as a clerk in a liquor store in the morning and went to school, was taking 14, 15 credits from about 3 in the afternoon until 7, 8, 10 o'clock at night at a city university system. And so that's how in school was, I came on a scholarship to a different school, to Yeshiva University, but I switched over ultimately to the city university because I was more interested in business, and the school I went to, the Bernard Baruch School, was noted for business school, and that's why I moved. That's how I managed to my education. Folks, thank you very much.
And Murray, I know that you all have dinner plans. We're certainly happy. Thank you. Great to see you all. Thanks again, Murray. Excellent. So we have some handouts.
Yes, of course. Delightful. Yeah. Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Not that we don't want you to stay, of course, but you're welcome to pause. And so 4 different kinds of handouts coming around. As we're doing this, we really want to make this as interactive as possible. So if y'all are sitting in the back, you could certainly come forward if you'd like to, if you're comfortable back there, but it'll certainly make it easier for us to ask you a whole series of questions. We want to begin really by asking, I know I asked for a raise of hands for folks who have taught in this area. Let's see again who's taught at least something on World War II and the Holocaust. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done?
I took a little notes on this. I've taught 9 several times.
Okay, which is part of the curriculum.
And with that, I also have added over the years the Walter Cronkite video on the Holocaust Museum when it was
Great.
first opened. And it ends with an interview with Elie Wiesel, which is
Excellent.
powerful.
And I'm sure the students really appreciate seeing his first-person narrative as we just witnessed Murray's. I think there's nothing like having access to someone. What else have you done?
I have, there's this, and I wish I jotted it down before I left, but I
Sure.
have a story. It's a nonfiction story.
Okay.
And we do this as a broad nonfiction unit of a story of children. I could bring it next week.
Sure.
It will help you, but it is children who were taken on a train to England. You know, they crossed borders and were
The
cared
kinder transport.
and this is a child's, from a child's, I guess she wrote it as an adult, but
Sure.
remembering it as a child.
Sure.
And I also have a story, which I always tie in, of a family of Japanese Americans who were held in an
Internment.
in California.
Definitely. And I know that's also part of the curriculum as well, and that a lot of teachers do that.
The final thing I do is two little girls. I didn't jot the stories down. I wish I had.
Sure.
The stories of 2 little girls who are, I think it's something like Sarah's not my name. It's not like that, but these 2 little girls who are from India, and they are going to school in a British school, but they're forced to take on British
Identity.
identity.
Sure.
And one of them absolutely refuses, and these are the things
Okay.
that happen.
So some good comparative work. Who else had raised their hand and said they had done something in World War II, the Holocaust? Anybody else? Now, are most of you all teachers 8 through 12 primarily? Okay. Which schools are you all representing? Just name out a couple. Okay. Where else?
I'm at West Hall High School.
Okay. Anywhere else? Okay, great. Rockdale, excellent. So a pretty diverse population representing a lot of different counties. So Cindy Van Groff, my colleague, and I, what we're going to do now is, as I said, make this as interactive as possible, but also talk a little bit about what we have at Kennesaw State done with Holocaust education. We work a lot with K through 12 teachers. What we see as sort of challenges and goals and issues and problems, and want to hear sort of what you might anticipate that you would struggle with as you're coming to this material. And then Cindy's going to talk a little bit about the Georgia Performance Standards and what areas we have found really particularly useful. And that's one of your handouts. You'll see the double-sided handout. And then also really end with a conversation that Cindy's going to lead us through, because she's really been guiding our curriculum through a project we do with the Butterfly Project, and then a Passports project we do at the end. So let me just give you a little bit of a background. Kennesaw State started the Holocaust education program in 2003 with the the Anne Frank exhibit. Did any of you all get a chance to come up and see that? Okay, so a couple folks came. So it was an exhibit that we had for 3 years. In 2005, we were given a $500,000 grant by the Marcus Foundation to develop the Holocaust education program. And when the Anne Frank exhibit closed, the university decided to, instead of taking another traveling exhibit, to actually curate an exhibit by the university, by faculty at the university on staff. And it was one of those funny meetings where you know you're sitting there and you know all of a sudden it's going to end up in your lap, and that's exactly what happened. So they gave it to me for 6 months to do a project that should have taken about 2 years. So we did what everybody in those moments does, which build really good, strong, and effective partnerships with the Holocaust Museum in D.C., the Anti-Defamation League, and the Atlanta History Center, where I also work as a curator. So that exhibit opened in January on the 18th, and there are really 3 exhibits. There's Parallel Journeys, World War II and the Holocaust Through the Eyes of Teens, and you'll see in your packet we've given you some sample pages from our website and really urge you to take a look at it. A lot of materials there. We also have the Butterfly Project, which Cindy's going to talk about in a minute, and then also V for Victory, Georgia Remembers World War II, which was an exhibit that opened at the History Center and is now permanently at Kennesaw. So when you come, and we certainly hope you will come, all of the exhibits are free and open to anybody, and we work very closely with teachers to develop curriculum that is useful to you. So if you happen to be doing a particular unit and you need a particular kind of program, we really have a lot to offer, and it's also very easy to get to. If y'all have not been to Kennesaw lately, it's right off 75, Cracker Barrel right next door. You can get whatever biscuit you want. It's just a very comfortable and easy space, and we've actually found school groups find it particularly easy to get to, and also really appreciate the fact that it's free, and that's one of our missions, is to make sure that it remains free and open to the public. So I want to begin by just talking about what we have seen as our goals and objectives teaching in the field, but then really talk again about what we think might be challenges and problems that you all would face or anticipate facing, and then really shift to some nuts and bolts. So, but we want to be mindful of your time, and we will be finished promptly at 7:30. So let's go. Obviously, some goals of Holocaust education. Sort of 3 big things that we think about is thinking about the Holocaust as a watershed event, not a singular event, but certainly a watershed event. We, as you've already suggested here in the front, like to put things in comparative perspective so students can see the history of anti-Semitism, they can see the history of intolerance, and telescoping in on the Holocaust really gives a nice opportunity to do that. But what we will often do is telescope in on that moment and then step back and make comparisons between certainly other forms of genocide and other sort of forms of racial, ethnic, and religious violence, but also especially for students studying American history to understand how things like slavery, things like the Japanese internment, things like Native American, if you want to call it genocide, I think it's certainly an appropriate thing to consider to put that within that broad context. So the Holocaust is one way to come to it. Again, not a singular event, but certainly a watershed. We also try to get students to think about the ramification of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping, and then also look at how technological expertise and bureaucratic infrastructure can become destructive. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily think about. The one thing that makes the Holocaust so extraordinary is that it was so very modern. The other issue is this sort of use and abuse of power and the roles and responsibility of individuals, both individuals, organizations, and of course nations when confronted with civil rights violations. So a lot of different things we try to achieve. And I wonder, for those of you who are confronting it, are there other things, other goals that you have as you're sort of contemplating teaching about the war or about Holocaust that are different in some ways, or maybe complementary to what we're doing? Anybody trying to do something different? Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yes. Of course. Sure. Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. In fact, my students, my university students who are upper division history majors still have that vision, right? That the war's over, that, that there's sort of peace, and that everybody kind of goes home and happy and buys their suburban home in Levittown, and then pretty soon it's Eisenhower. Next thing you know, civil rights movement. Now it's the 90s. It's very difficult for students to see how long it takes to change. Anybody else have any other goals that would be sort of complementary or similar? Yes. Yes. You're coming to one of my challenges. Yeah. Sure. Okay. Sure. 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 And why does it matter to them? I mean, that's a very real problem. Hang on to that thought for a second, and let's shift to this very issue, which is the challenges and sort of what has been your experience. Let's come to that question sort of at the end, and we've already sort of addressed it, but these 4 issues are exactly this very first one, connecting the past and the present, that even with students who aren't necessarily 4 or 5 years behind or aren't necessarily from an African American community are still having trouble connecting. I think students simply in general have trouble connecting with this period. So Cindy and I had an interesting experience about a week and a half ago when the middle school was here, Dalton Middle. We had how many students? 3? Yeah. And so a largely Hispanic community where students were 8th grade, mostly 8th grade, I think. So English was not their first language, but they're very gifted students, really interested in the topic. And Cindy, actually, as she's been developing our curriculum, is trying to get the students to think about what anti-Semitism is and how anti-Semitism works and what its sort of long history was, and asking about what might be an analogy to anti-Semitism. And many of the students talked about, sort of anti-immigration policies and hatred of Mexicans, and could see how that conversation made sense to them, that they looked inside their own experience and sort of connected. But I think that is one of the greatest challenges, I think, in our teaching in general. I frankly have trouble sometimes getting my students, who are very invested in this topic, who are even thinking about graduate school in this topic, to still really get excited about it, to see how it connects, and to see its significance historically. So let me talk about these other 3. And something I call Holocaust etiquette. And I don't know if you all have ever experienced this, but there's certainly a narrative about the Holocaust in America, about what happened, how it happened, and sort of what our general assumptions are about it. And so when Murray finished his conversation and said, does anybody have any questions? This is a very common experience, and my students have been telling me that this is a common experience, that they are fearful of asking questions. Because they certainly don't want to appear disrespectful in any way. But they also feel that his experience is so extraordinary that it makes him inaccessible to them, that they feel so respectful and so awed by his experience that they feel that they cannot necessarily come to him and ask a question that might be a burning question, or something that might be perceived as, unreasonable or disrespectful. And that for many of my students, and I think we could probably agree, is that, and Holocaust survivors have told me this, that they feel like their only identity is as a Holocaust survivor, that they have no other identity. They're not a father, they're not a brother, they're not a friend, and that the idea of humor or any of this, what we think of sort of normal human behavior, is sort of not expected of them. And that's a relatively common experience. Have you ever had your students, or have you ever had this sort of experience in dealing with survivors or dealing with the Holocaust in general? I've had teachers tell me that they feel the topic is so big and so massive and so dreadful that they are fearful of teaching in the area, for getting something wrong, for, again, making some sort of fatal mistake. Have you all had any of this kind of experience? Yep. Sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. Sure.
And then I told him that my best friend was, is from New Orleans. I've been there and seen it, right out there.
Sure.
And gone back. And once I started talking about the things that I saw, and he realized, okay, I was there, and like the stories that I had heard from everybody, then he started opening up. And so
Sure.
just that, making that.
Absolutely, and I think you're right. It is sort of coming to the material. Another thing that I find in teaching in the field is that my students, because they have assumptions that, of course, all Jews are victims and all Germans are Nazis, right? I mean, that's a relatively common narrative, that when confronted with evidence of Nazis who did extraordinary and heroic things and Jews who did dreadful things, that they find that very, very difficult to reconcile. What Primo Levi, who wrote Survival in Auschwitz, calls the gray zone. History and sort of stories that don't fit the sort of classic narrative about what we think about the Holocaust really poses this issue, and that so I really think the sort of concept of etiquette is an interesting one. Let me talk for just a moment about these last two. One is, of course, Holocaust denial, right? Certainly a challenge in teaching in this field is that there is a very real problem of Holocaust denial. And in fact, at Kennesaw, and I would urge you all to come, and I will send the information to Laura, that we're doing a symposium next week that's open to teachers, of course, the public students, on, we call it Jewish Life in the South, and it's our 4th annual symposium up at Kennesaw. Starts at 6 o'clock with a reception and 7 o'clock with a talk on hate crimes in the South. So the Anti-Defamation League, and then a very long time man who I cannot identify where he works because we are banned from saying, but who has 30 years of experience working within hate crimes in the South. When Murray was saying there's a charge to us as educators to keep this conversation going, I mean, we can simply walk outside and see neo-Nazis, in the South doing, frankly, just about anywhere, perpetuating these kind of ideals. This did not end by any means. So if you're interested in that symposium, I'll pass it to Laura and make sure that you've got the information. Very much love to have you. It's open and, again, free to the public and a delightful reception at the same time. But let me also talk about this concept of Holocaust fatigue, and then I want to hand it over to Cindy. Michael Blumenthal from the Holocaust Museum was telling this really interesting story, and I wonder how you all would feel about it. He said, several weeks ago at the home of some new acquaintances in Berlin, a kind and amiable family who had invited us over for Sunday dinner, there arose a subject of their adolescent sons and their schoolmates' Holocaust fatigue, right? So they're in Berlin at a brunch, of having the Holocaust perpetually rammed down their throats by teachers and administrators at every turn. He was tired, the son said, of hearing so much about the Holocaust, a period in Germany's history during which he was not even alive, and for which, by definition, he and his generation could shoulder no responsibility. Fatigue is defined by my dictionary as the temporary inability to respond to a situation or perform a function because of overexposure, implying that to be fatigued, one must have been abundantly exposed to something. But many of those prone to Holocaust fatigue, much like those who suffer from its sibling malady, compassion fatigue in the United States, tend to be those who, with a self-serving interest in being tired rather than a moral stake in being curious. In other words, those whose sense of fatigue has little to do with actual knowledge. And I would actually argue that we probably have an analogous situation on slavery, right? Analogous situation on the civil rights movement, where you hear students say, "Oh, I've heard that," right? I know that story, where frankly they know almost nothing about that story, but they might be getting the same sort of brief, sort of stereotypical narrative. Okay, I've learned something about the Middle Passage, so I know everything there is to know about slavery. I've learned something about Martin Luther King, and I've seen I Have a Dream, so I know everything I need to know about the civil rights movement, which is, of course, an absurd concept. But I do think this concept of Holocaust fatigue is present and is something that you will periodically hear from students. More commonly, I think students tend to be fascinated by the period, and almost morbidly fascinated by the period. Not exactly obsessed with Hitler, but certainly intrigued by Hitler, intrigued by the sheer numbers and the sort of drama of it. And in fact, I have I've rarely had a difficult sell to a student to talk about World War II and the Holocaust. They are generally fascinated with it. And even after, when we did the opening of the exhibit, we had Regina and Sam Spiegel from the Holocaust Museum, longtime volunteers who survived the camps. And Regina was telling this wonderful story, and she's very funny, and the students were kind of stunned, that she was funny, and they're laughing, and they're like, oh, my God, I'm laughing, with a Holocaust survivor, which they found a kind of jarring experience. And at one point, she said, and I can't remember, Cindy, how she said it, but she was saying something like, well, I left, something behind, and she pulls up her sleeve, and is showing the tattoo. And I think every student in that room had this sort of jarring moment of, my God, here's the artifact of this in this room with me. Not just the person, but the actual tattoo itself. So I think students really, there are plenty of ways to kind of pull them in. And I want to let Cindy talk for a bit about what we've tried, and then let you all ask questions and issues. And this certainly, I hope, would not be the only conversation we have. I know you all have got a very rich curriculum, but know that we are here as a resource, a free resource to you. And we have a whole staff and a lot of great volunteers and docents that would be happy to work with you in your classes as you're doing this. But Cindy, if you don't mind, we can... Let's see. Here's the Butterfly Project. I'll keep the poem clipping along. Yep.
Okay. First of all, I'm not even sure. How many of you are social studies teachers? How many are? Is everybody social studies? No, we have some English teachers. Okay. Economics. Okay. All right. Great. There's a handout that's addresses some of the standards, the Georgia performance standards, and obviously. The ones that are fairly straightforward are obviously the social studies ones. But the ones that I feel that I really drew on when I went into the exhibit and started to work on it and tried to create curriculum for it was I drew on your Quality Core curriculum. I really think that, citizenship and respect for others, this is really the place where you can really start to talk about those issues of how to treat each other, and that, this is the most horrendous thing that has happened, and so let's take it out there and let's look at it and let's address it. And that's the big question I ask the kids when I do a tour. The first basically is, how could reasonable people be convinced that this was a great idea? This was a way to solve problems. And they're kind of stunned, and then they sort of sit back and they start to think about it. So I think if you can kind of address those issues with them and bring it out on the table and just be willing to talk about it openly. And, it is a hard subject, and people do kind of shy away from it. But if you just put it on the table and say, how could we do this? How could people? These were reasonable, rational people. And then let's go through and let's look at what it is. It's fear-based. Okay, and people operate in a different mode when they're in fear-based, and then start talk about the history and talk about what was going on. World War I had come to end. Germany was in terrible shape, and people were terrified. And they come along this man with this idea, and well, that's a possibility. And and then you can talk about prejudice being embedded in people's minds, and how easy it is to sort of spark those prejudice and get those going, and then start talking about prejudice and talk about it in all fashions, in all forms. Take it to the Native Americans, take it to the slavery issue, take it, you don't have to stay stuck in particularly the Holocaust. At least I feel, it's a good way to go with the kids. I just sort of open the dialogue, and so that is one way I do it with them. And then the other thing that we do is to bring in the arts. I have a bachelor's of fine arts, so to me, arts are just another way of getting kids to be able to express maybe something they can't verbally. And so you can start out, and that's the Butterfly Project you want to flip on to.
And I don't know if I said it, it's a project the Holocaust Museum Houston started, 2 years ago?
I think so, 2003 maybe? Yeah.
Where they're trying to capture, or trying to get people to think about the 1.5 million children who were killed during the Holocaust. So they've been asking people around the world, really, to create butterflies as part of that. So we've actually been, some of our art department, University Studies, have already created about 2,000. But many of our students who come, we try to give an art project
Yeah.
with it. So there's a poem that goes with it that we have. I'll just flash through it. And you can.
Yes, we start out usually by having them read the poem. Someone reads it out loud. And then can we go into the visual of the gallery? Oh, you took that out. Okay, well, in the gallery, so we take them in the gallery, and in the gallery are about 150, 200 butterflies on display. So we give them the opportunity. Oh, yeah. Oh. And we give them the opportunity to take a look at the butterflies and get a sense of, what materials are there, and sort of talk to them, too, about this is an opportunity to talk about feelings and what colors, express what kind of feelings, what kind of materials might you use to define a child as opposed to maybe a teen, or, what kinds of ways you would go about expressing an individual's personality. And then we kind of charge them with the task of taking on and creating a butterfly that is going to give voice back to these people that were silenced, these 1.5 million children that were silenced, and try to find a way to create a piece of artwork that, their spirits are certainly were taken from them, but if we can find a way to give it flight again, certainly I think that's a really great way to give kids an entry into this. And then we talk about the loss of potential. The loss of human potential, the fact that we don't know with that 1.5 million people what they would have done.
Testament.